displaced. So what's going to happen is people, leave wherever they ended up at the end of the war, are going to return to their homes. They'll find if they even have a home, even a village or a town, because some places have been totally wiped out, not to mention the population. So you see that in the ruins of Stalin from the Soviet Union is going to send out agents into Western Europe, trying to stir up revolution, spreading rumors that the United States is going to start a new empire in Europe, right? And you also got to remember that during the occupation, many of these countries' resistance movements were often led by communists. So communists, say in France and Italy, are actually heroes. So the big worry of the United States is that many of these so-called heroes are going to be running for office and for communist takeover. So the United States, seeing all this in a sense, a lot of aggression by communist powers, are going to come up with a new idea, a new policy towards that. And this is going to be the famous Truman Doctrine in 1947, the Truman Doctrine. What I'd like you to do is put in parentheses the containment policy. In other words, what we're going to do, I'm sorry, 1947. What we're going to do is contain communism. We can't remove it where it already is. So what we're going to try to do is contain it, not allow it to spread. Right? This is your famous containment policy. Now, the Secretary of State under President Truman is a guy named George C. Marshall. And Mr. Marshall, during the war, was the top general of American armed forces. Only the president was higher than he was. However, he is going to resign at the end of the war and become the Secretary of State under Harry Truman. Now, what's going to happen as part of this containment policy, the United States is going to attempt to create a major economic aid plan. They're going to spend billions of dollars to rebuild Western Europe. In other words, start to rebuild it so that people will have a stake in this and that are less likely to turn towards communist revolution. So they're going to spend billions of dollars to rebuild Europe. They even offered the Soviet Union money, but the Soviet Union declines. Mm-hmm. And what we're starting to see is tension building between the United States and the Soviet Union, particularly over Eastern Europe. Again, Eastern Europe is occupied by the Soviet Union. You got to remember that in World War I, there was over 25 million people killed. In World War II, over 50 million people killed. Of that 50 million, about 25 million were Russians. So the Russians took the biggest hit in World War II. And because of that, they feel that, hey, we fought Germany twice in this century already, in the 20th century. It's not even half the century yet. So what they want to do is create a buffer between Germany and the Soviet Union, right? They don't want to go through this again. So that's why it's so important for them to make sure they have friendly governments in Eastern Europe right next to them. Let's see if we can see a little of that. Appreciate it. Thank you. So, Soviet Union wants to control all these states here, right? Keep them from Germany. So, that's the biggest problem for in terms of the United States and the Soviet Union. Uh, what we're going to see is that Germany has been divided into 4 occupation zones. In 1948, the United States decides to take its zone, British zone, and the French zone and create the Republic of West Germany. Okay? In other words, create another country that they control. And the Soviets are going to be very upset by that. So Stalin decides that he's going to block American, British, and French from getting into Berlin. Remember, the capital of Germany, Berlin, is also divided into 4 occupation zones. So now, the zones controlled by the United States, Britain, and France are going to be part of West Germany. And so, to get into Berlin, you have to go through the Soviet zone. So Stalin is going to block that. He says you can't come through. And he says if you try to force your way through, it's going to be war. The United States decides, okay, they decide to send or create an airlift. They're going to send planes into Berlin 24 hours, 7 days a week, bringing in supplies. And they did the Russians or the Soviets, if you shoot our plane down, it's war. Right? So now the tensions are building between the two. Ultimately, the airlift really does work, and eventually the Soviet Union backs down and allows the American, British, and French to come through. Then what we're going to see is that in 1949, there's going to be a lot of problems in a sense. First, the Soviet Union is going to shock the world and explode its own atomic bomb. You got to remember, the Soviet Union had spies at part of the Manhattan Project. Remember, the Manhattan Project is the name of the plan to build the atomic bomb in the first place. That's the code name, Manhattan Project. And Soviet Union had spies all along. And some of the physicists that worked on it were communists, and communist sympathizers. And so Stalin always had plans to the bomb anyway. So this is going to shock the United States, and now we're going to see more anti-communist sentiment and great fear. But now the United States no longer has the monopoly on the bomb that they once had. And then how did these Soviets get the secret? There must be communists in our country and in our government. But this is going to cause what we call the Red Scare, so to speak, and the rise of this fanatical anti-communism, that's the way to put it. Now, in 1949, China, the Chinese communists win their civil war. So now China is now part of the communist world. And they're bringing in 600 million people. And so now a large percentage of the world's population is under communist rule. The United States is really nervous about this. And they form a new military alliance known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO. We're going to have countries like the United States, Britain, France, Norway, Canada, Italy, and a few of West Germany as part of this military alliance. A few years later, in 1955, the Soviet Union is going to also form its own military alliance to counter NATO by bringing in the Eastern European countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc., and create the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw, W-A-R-S-A-W, that is the capital of Poland, Warsaw. So it's called the Warsaw Pact. That's the Soviet Union's military alliance with Eastern Europe primarily. Now, we're going to see that communism is going to continue to spread. Now, 49, China becomes communist. India becomes independent in 1947. Right? They leave the British Empire, still close to Britain. All right? Now, Korea, well, before I get to Korea, Japan is now firmly under control of the United States, but for several years after the war, the United States occupied Japan and helped them create a new government, a new constitution, very much like our own. However, in terms of military, the Japanese are limited just to defensive forces. They're allowed to defensive forces. Right now, presently, they're thinking about becoming a little bit bigger in terms of their military. So China, present-day China, is now interested in these islands. All these little islands. China is claiming these islands as their own. As a result, they've been having problems with Japan, having problems with Korea, having problems with the Philippines, and having problems with Vietnam, which is something to be watched in the future. But nonetheless, getting back, in the last week of World War II, the Russians finally declared war on Japan and come through Manchuria all the way down to Korea to this point. Now they have control of this part of Korea. They install a leader, Kim Sung, who is the grandfather of the present leader of North Korea. He is put into charge, and now we have a communist government in North Korea. In 1950, in June 1950, he invades South Korea. Now this starts the Korean War. Now the United States says at this point we got to do something. This is just blatant aggression. So what the United States does is goes to the United Nations and says, well, we have this military aggression by North Korea. We need to put that in check. So the United Nations decides, as the United Nations, a police action. So when I asked you police action on the test, you said, you never said that. Anyway, police action. Number of countries of the United Nations are going to contribute troops. General MacArthur, who has been commander of American forces in the Pacific during World War II, was put in charge. And the North Koreans are almost down all the way to the very tip. So what he decides to do is have an invasion, an amphibious invasion, right on this side of the west, of the northwest, and which is successful. And he's trying to cut off the North Koreans who are down here. They are forced back into North Korea, and he steadily advances all the way into the northern part of North Korea, close to the Chinese border. Now you got to remember the Chinese communists have taken over China in 1949, the year before. So they're very nervous that the United States Army, well, not just the United States Army, but forces, are that close to their border. They continue to warn the United States to not come any closer. Now, President Truman tells MacArthur, you need to back off. But we don't want to instigate a war with China and then the Soviet Union comes in before you know we have an atomic war. So he tells him to back off. MacArthur continues, and what happens is several 100,000 Chinese troops come pouring over the border. They did not expect that many, that fast. And so what we will see is that, one, MacArthur is going to get fired because he disobeyed the president, and two, they're going to push the Americans all the way back. I keep saying Americans, but the UN forces all the way back to what the present order is right now. Right? So, right now, there is no peace treaty between North Korea, South Korea, or the UN. It's simply a ceasefire. So technically, the war is still on. So 50 years later, over 50 years. And that is the most militarized border between North and South. There's over several million landmines all through there in between. And the North Koreans, every so often, you always have these incidents. But they are very, very tough militarily, and they are very, well, they call it the Hermit Kingdom. They call it the hermit kingdom because they're so isolated from the rest of the world. You know, hardly anybody knows what's going on, and they put a lot of money into the military, and while the people are always on the verge of starvation, so they always got problems over there. So now we have the Korean War. Then let's go down to Vietnam. See, all these things are happening after the war because the European countries that used to have all the empires, the British, the French, are weak. They cannot sustain those empires like they can. So what we're going to see is a number of countries within their empires are going to be looking for liberation. Okay? Some choose communism as the vehicle by which to liberate their country. So, which is an interesting thing about Vietnam. Vietnam was controlled by the French. This is called French Indochina, all this stuff. And the Vietnamese are very resentful of any foreign domination. They don't care who it is. They just don't like it. So there's always been problems. So a Vietnamese scholar in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, goes to Paris to study, which a lot of them did, and starts to follow communist thinking. He goes to the Soviet Union, where he's trained as a revolutionary, and takes on the name Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh is going to return to Vietnam to try to stir up revolution against the French. And you got to remember something. Communism doesn't believe in nationalism. However, Ho Chi Minh is a nationalist and a communist, if that's possible. Because he really wants to liberate his country. And he thinks communism is the best way. So when the Japanese, after they bombed Pearl Harbor, occupied a good part of all this, right? Ho Chi Minh is going to help create a Vietnamese resistance to the Japanese, as well as working with the Americans to push the Japanese out. When the Japanese are finally defeated in 1945, Ho Chi Minh thinks, hey, we got them out. The French have been beaten up by the Germans during the war. They're weak. He declares Vietnam independent. He even quotes on Independence Day from Abraham Lincoln. Very, very, wants to be very friendly to the United States. However, the French decide they want to come back in. So the French come back in and say, you're not independent. So this starts the French phase of the Vietnam War, where Ho Chi Minh and his forces are going to battle the French and defeat the French in a famous battle known as Dien Bien Phu. It's in the book, don't even ask me to spell it, because it's in the book, D-I-E-M. That bad was against me. Go look it up. It's Dien Bien Phu. I'm not sure about it. Anyway, that battle is one of the first and only battles at that time where a colonial people overthrow their imperial masters. So now, the French are defeated, and the Vietnamese communists think that they have control of the country. They have peace talks in Geneva, Switzerland, in which the United States and the French, particularly the United States, promises free elections. If you have free elections, Ho Chi Minh is going to win. The United States starts to realize that and decides not to have free elections, but rather create the Republic of South Vietnam, essentially splitting the country in two, sort of like North Korea, South Korea. But the Vietnamese communists say, no, we're not doing that. And this begins the American phase of the Vietnam War. The United States, to help the government of South Vietnam, first sends in advisors. This is around 1963 under President John Kennedy. And he just sent in some advisors to help their army. Their army wasn't doing well. And so after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, President Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And in 1964 to 1965, he decides to send American troops to Vietnam. First it's about, 100,000, 50 to 100,000, and each year after that it builds up, builds up. So then at some point they almost had something like 600 to 700,000 soldiers. Now, they think they got the Vietnamese beaten. And in 1968, President Johnson is saying, oh, the war looks like it's being won. But we see a major explosion of violence in 68, known as the Tet Offensive. The communists decide to show we have not disappeared and attack all the major cities in South Vietnam, even the American embassy. Now, in doing that, actually, the communists suffer a big defeat. However, the very fact that they're able to mount such an offensive shows the American people that this war is not over. And we already have protests going on in the streets. Now the protests intensify. And so, in a sense, that Tet Offensive wasn't a military victory, but a political victory for the North Vietnamese and the communists. Because Americans got tired. And another thing that's happened. Our whole society here in New York is about to change. But what happens is, and you can talk to your fathers or grandfathers who went to Vietnam, or people who were here. All of a sudden, these guys start coming home, and oftentimes many of them are addicted to drugs. Because Vietnam and many of those areas have nothing but opium and serious marijuana. Right? And they start smoking and getting high, and then they start smoking that heroin and opium, and guys will come back junkies. Now, many of you saw that movie American Gangster with Denzel Washington playing this guy Frank Lucas. Now, there was a Frank Lucas, and there was a Frank Matthews, and up in the Bronx here, we had Nicky Barnes, and all these guys. These are the worst guys that ever freaking came down into our community. They destroyed us. They sent all of us back, black, white, Latino, sent us back because so many young men and women became addicted to heroin. Heroin was pouring into our streets. And what that started to do, it created tremendous crime wave here in New York and elsewhere. And that's when you start to see people put bars on their windows, people get mugged, women get their pocketbooks snatched. That used to never happen. Criminals, they've always been criminals, but they were reasonable criminals. They weren't as crazy as people started to get on these drugs. But that changed American society. And because the war was so unpopular, you start to create this or shall I say, counterculture, where you start to see more hippies and things like that. Militancy amongst the black community increases. So there's a lot of upheaval during this time, the late 60s into the 70s. And so that changes America. Drugs become a major part of our society. Before Vietnam, there was always drugs, but only in very certain places, right? The very poor, musicians, those types of people tend to get involved with that. Now, it's mainstream, and it's been that way ever since. So Vietnam is a very major part in terms of our own culture and how we change. Any questions about Vietnam in these times? Okay.
So the split between South and North Vietnam.
Yeah.
Was so Vietnam was united now after the war?
And again?
Was it united or no?
Oh, in 1975 when the United States left, and the day the last guys leave, the North Vietnamese are coming into South Vietnam. It was a major panic. People who had worked with the United States all through those years now are panicking. They want to come to the United States because they figured there would be a big bloodbath by the communists, of which there really wasn't. Of course, they did take out a few people who they particularly didn't like. But other than that, there wasn't no bloodbath. That was the big fear. So Vietnam is united, and they do control their own country. Now, just to show you, this is really not about communism. some years later, the Chinese, having some problems in Vietnam as always, started to have some territorial disputes. And the Chinese sent the free troops down here. North Vietnamese, what am I saying? They're now united. The Vietnamese, they jack up the Chinese. They can fight. Remember, they fought for 30 years straight. Could you imagine that? And then, in the last 10 years, they're fighting the most powerful country in the world. North Vietnam, had more bombings than all World War II. They bombed the hell out of them, and they still kept fighting. See, a lot of people don't understand. The United States doesn't live there. We don't live there. But they do live there. Where are they going? You go before they will. But that's their strategy. We can outlast you. We can't beat you militarily. All we have to do is stay alive and keep fighting. But sooner or later, you're going to get tired. And you're going to want to go home. See, one of the worst things they did in Vietnam is make Vietnam like home. A lot of guys will tell you, when you're out in the jungle, but when you come back to your base, they used to have beer and barbecues and all this stuff, trying to make it feel a little like home. You should never make it feel like that. But then you get a little too complacent. And war is not about being complacent. You got to be into it or not, one way or the other. So that caused a lot of problems for us as a society. Anything else you guys want? Yes.
Did they use guerrilla warfare tactics to their advantage? Vietnamese?
Oh yeah, but don't forget they've been fighting the French 1941 to 1975. How many years is that? 34 years. So what they used to do is that the Vietnamese created these roads along the border, often in the next country, Laos, along the border, all the way down. And what they did is they created these little roads. So from underground, they used to have these underground complexes that go from hospitals, rest areas, underground. And so when the United States bombed over there, they're over in this area, they will bomb, they go underground the best way. They go dark and then they come back out, and that's how they kept doing it. Now, what started to happen is the United States in the later half of the war, particularly CIA, began this assassination situation where they looked to assassinate South Vietnamese communist leaders. See, there was two segments to the North Vietnamese military. You have the regular military, and then you have the guerrillas. The guerrillas are known as Viet Cong. They almost wiped out the Viet Cong to the point where the North Vietnamese had to, their regular soldiers had to become more and more involved. So ultimately, as I said, the political pressure on in the United States to end the war became so much. The United States decided this was time to go. As soon as they did, the whole thing collapsed, and Vietnam is united as a result. Now, Cambodia is an interesting thing. Cambodia tried to stay out of the war, and however, in '68, they had a coup, a military coup, by this guy who was pro-United States, the guy they had before trying to balance between the United States and the communists. So, coup, eventually, when the Vietnamese win, the communists win in Cambodia. Now, in their situation, you had a guy named Pol Pot. Pol Pot was a serious communist, but not like the Vietnamese. He decided that, remember when we talked about Marx said that he's going to get rid of all the capitalists, and if you were a capitalist or you had capitalist feelings, you would go to re-education camps. So what he did is empty all the cities. Can you imagine that? A big city like New York, and everybody had to leave and to go to these camps. Now, if they thought you were seriously capitalist, whatever, they kill you. They killed over 1 million people. So that was a bloodbath that they thought would have happened in Vietnam. It doesn't happen. And Pol Pot, these guys are just really, really crazy. They used to call it the killing fields. The fields where people got killed in the movie. And he was so crazy, even the Vietnamese said, yo, you're way out of line. Vietnamese communists came in and got rid of him. They was out of control. I had an art teacher back in the day when I was in high school who was very apolitical, not into politics, a sort of hippie guy, long hair and stuff. He even was on an acid trip at my graduation. That's how freaky he was, right? I'm in school, in graduate school, I saw him and he had turned into a communist, a Cambodian-type Pol Pot supporter, until they found out what he was doing. And my man, he just went over the deep end because he got so into it. And then when he realized what a murder butcher this guy really was, he just flipped out. But anyway, that's his life. Yes.
Okay, the communists, the nationalists, and then there's another one. It was a reference to.
We talk about which country?
In Germany or
Germany?
in Europe. In Europe, I wanted to
Well,
understand
this is what you have. Two countries survived World War II to become superpowers. The United States had seemingly inexhaustible industrial power. We have yet to even hit our full capacity. Then the Soviet Union won, they suffered greatly, but they had almost seemingly an endless amount of men. That's so that combination is what destroyed Germany. So here they are, one is communist, one is capitalist, really sworn to hate each other. After they get rid of their mutual enemy, now the tensions between them increase. And because, as I said before, the European imperial powers are now weakened by 2 world wars, right? All within 50 years of each other. 2 world wars. Britain is weaker. France is weaker. The Netherlands is weaker. Belgium is weaker, all right? And so as a result, now colonies in Africa and Asia are now thinking about independence, but now they sense the weakness of the European imperialists. We see in India, for example, by 1947, you have guys like Mahatma Gandhi, through his peace movement, is going to cause India to become independent. The thing about India, without the British, there would have been no India. But India was made up of a lot of separate little kingdoms that the British beat up over time and created one big colony. So when the war is over, as a group, they want independence. So that was a peaceful transition. Right? However, in Asia, China was not peaceful. Korea is not peaceful. Vietnam wasn't peaceful. Right? You'll see a communist insurrection in Malaysia. This is Malaysia down here. The Chinese supports the communists here, but they got defeated, so that stays in the so-called Western side. You have Indonesia. Indonesia was a colony of the Netherlands. They are going to become independent in 1949. Right? So you have all these countries turning independent. And see, see, Jose? See this little road here? This is along the border. See how they have these blue waves that's coming in? How they came. Let me see. Let's look at Africa. You'll see in Africa, Libya becomes independent in 1951. Ghana is the first sub-Saharan African nation to become have Ivory Coast, 1960, Togo, 1960, Nigeria, 1960, Congo, 1960, Angola, 1975. Here, Angola and Mozambique was controlled by Portugal. These are very rich colonies for the Portuguese. They didn't want to give it up. So, two very dirty civil wars here. Ultimately, Black Africans win. Of course, we know about South Africa. So, you can see, particularly in the late 50s into the early 60s, that's when we see all these African nations start to become independent. Now, the problem with these independent countries is that the borders are borders created by, you remember the Conference of Berlin? How they sliced up the cake? They didn't care who was there. They just grabbed what they thought they wanted. No regard for the people who lived there. That's one of the biggest problems of Africa today. These borders do not match where people really live. You might have a border where half a tribe or a nation of people on one side of the border and the other side is on the other side. And on the other side, they might be a minority amongst another group who don't like them being in there. And that is one of the biggest problems of Africa. Because they constantly do all this infighting amongst themselves because of these borders. These borders are all messed. Any questions about that?
Yes, briefly. Could you tell me why they were fighting like they were in Rwanda? Why
Well,
were they genocide?
a perfect example of what I'm talking about. In Rwanda, here it is, right now. You have Rwanda, you have Burundi, you have Uganda. In Rwanda, the majority people are the Hutu. Okay? What's the name of the other ones? Tutsi. The Tutsis were sort of very friendly with the French. And the French tended to make sure they were educated, etc. And they kind of dominated the people in Rwanda, the Hutu. The Hutu began to resent that, and that's why we had that massacre. About a week or 2 weeks, over 1 billion people killed.
Yeah, it was horrible. I don't understand why.
Because you had a couple of hotheads that got people off. Oh, your problems are caused by this group.
Yeah, I got
You
that.
always have to be very careful about when people say, oh, it's not our fault, it's those guys' fault. Because see, what they're doing is trying to find a scapegoat to blame for your own problem. It's just like you're the cause of your own problem, but you keep blaming other people instead of dealing with what's wrong with yourself. That's one of the biggest problems. So again, that was a perfect example of the borders. The borders are not right. And so therefore, it leads to this type of mass killing like that. That's one of the biggest problems that Africa has. These borders. These borders are not correct. Any other questions? So let's see a little film about the Cold War, and we can see some of the players. That's it. That's too bad. It's been warm, right?
Hi.
A warm.